Good evening. On behalf of the Cuba program of the Institute of Latin American Studies at Columbia University, I wish to welcome you to this evening's webinar, Update, Nicaragua and Cuba. I will now turn the webinar over to Professor Jo Marie Burt from George Mason University. Jo Marie.
Thank you, Meg. It's a real pleasure to be here today with all of you to moderate this event on Nicaragua and Cuba. We have three very distinguished speakers who I will introduce in a moment. I'd just briefly like to go over the format for today's event before we get started. Each of our speakers will have 20 minutes for their remarks. I ask all of you to have your microphones off unless it's your turn to speak. I'll hold up a sign when you have 2 minutes left, and again when your time is up. After the presentations, we will have hopefully about 30 minutes for Q&A. And so I'm going to ask the audience members who'd like to pose a question to our panelists to type your questions into the Q&A box, which you'll find at the bottom right hand of your screen. If you would like to direct your question to a specific speaker, please be sure to note that in your question. And during the Q&A, I'll be retrieving the questions and posing them to the speakers. Please note that there are over 350 people signed up for today's webinar. Whether they all show up or not, we don't know, but I do apologize in advance if we're not able to get to all of the questions. So now let me very briefly introduce our speakers. Dr. Mark Ungar is Professor of Political Science at Brooklyn College and of the Criminal Justice and Political Science doctoral programs at the CUNY Graduate Center. Mark has written widely on police reform, citizen security, human rights and violence, and his most recent book is Policing Democracy, Overcoming Obstacles to Citizen Security in Latin America. He's recently returned from Nicaragua, where he was working on police and military reform, and he'll speak to us about the current situation in Nicaragua. Dr. Margaret Crahan is a senior research scholar and director of the Cuba program at the Institute of Latin American Studies at Columbia University. She's written widely on democracy and human rights in Latin America and is a renowned expert on Cuba. Her most recent publications include Cuba-US Relations, Normalization and Its Challenges, and Donald J. Trump y las relaciones Cuba-Estados Unidos en la encrucijada, both with Soraya Castro Marino. Dr. Crahan will provide a historical examination of protests in the 90s and the current situation in Cuba. Our third speaker is Dr. Philip Brenner. He's Professor Emeritus of International Relations and History at American University. He's also published widely on Cuba, specifically US-Cuba relations, also on US-Latin American relations, contemporary US foreign policy, and the Cuban Missile Crisis. His most recent book is Cuba at the Crossroads, co-authored with John Kirk and William Leo Grant. Dr. Brenner will discuss the current situation in Cuba with a focus on US-Cuban relations. Without further ado, I'm going to turn the mic over to Dr. Mark Ungar. Mark?
Thank you, Jo Marie, and thank you, Meg, for the opportunity to speak, and thank you, everyone, for joining. I'm going to speak about Nicaragua, which is, of course, a big concern and growing concern throughout Latin America. And what I thought I would do is provide a brief background on how the country has gotten to the situation that it's in, talk about the work that I've been doing there on police reform, and then talk about prospects for the elections in November. Most of you are probably familiar with some of the background in the power that Ortega has taken, the authoritarianism that has enveloped the country over the past several years. As a first longer background, as many of you know, Ortega came into power after being elected in 2006 with just 38% of the vote, based on a pact called El Pacto, which he had with his opposite former president, Arnoldo Alemán, which allowed him to take over. And when he took over in 2007, began to quickly control the judiciary, the legislature, and other parts of the state. He was funded in large part through Venezuela, which provided about $500 million a year in aid through programs such as Plan Techo, Plan Horno, other social service programs. And beyond the capture of the state by the Sandinista Party and control of state services, he's also maintained control by direct power over key institutes. All power in Nicaragua now runs through El Carmen, which is the presidential compound, Ortega directly controls the police and other forces. Rosario Murillo, his wife and vice president, controls the very powerful Consejos de Poder Ciudadano, the CPCs, which are a major center of power in Nicaragua. Their family also has a lot of control. 8 of their 9 children control the major firms on oil distribution, TV stations, PR firms. They control the COSEP, which is the Private Enterprise Council. They ally with pro-Sandinista businessmen in key economic areas like agro-export, tourism, telecommunications, land speculation, finances, and the military. So a very strong military family control over the economic sector. Things started to go south for them when the money from Venezuela began to dry up. And it exploded in April 2018, as many of you know, with an upheaval in many of the cities when people started protesting a reform that Ortega had decreed that would increase taxes and decrease benefits for people. Over 300 people were killed, hundreds and hundreds of people were detained, tortured, and are still being held in prison. And more broadly than that is a constant control over civil society, surveillance, harassment of activists, a low burn of complete control over anyone who is seen as an opponent of the regime. So for example, in December 2019, they stripped many NGOs of legal status. Hundreds of journalists, at least 100 journalists have fled. Hundreds of health professionals have been fired. National university professors were fired in 2018. In the meetings that we've been having on Zoom over the past year, many people are basically under house arrest. They can't leave their home. When I was there in May, I went to visit some colleagues at the Universidad Centroamericana, and the police surround the campus. So going in and out of the campus is also a form of the control that they've had. And the other problem is that the private sector and the civil society sector are very divided by ideology, by background, by mutual antagonism that they've had over the years. So the religious community, evangelical, Catholic, and other church areas. And that, of course, has played into Ortega and allowed him to take a lot of power. A fourth point is the power of the youth and his very skillful use of youth groups. In particular, the Sandinistas have hired youth to disrupt rallies, to intimidate people. In particular, they give a lot of high-powered weapons to young people to disrupt rallies, and then they allow them to keep those weapons. So it's increased crime, it's increased youth connections with the Sandinista party. There's a para-police force, which is heavily composed of young people as well, gangs and other informal armed groups that are heavily connected with the Sandinista regime. A fifth point is the high levels of corruption. It pervades all levels. It goes up to the highest levels of government. And there are many examples of that too. I just wanted to mention as emblematic is the when Nicaragua started becoming under scrutiny by the international financial community for money laundering, they created a Unidad de Análisis Financiero to monitor it, but it has since been used to launder money instead of actually monitoring laundering of money. There's a group called the Albanesa Group, which is a importing and distribution business, which took over the distribution of money from Venezuela, which was supposed to be going towards social programs, but has been used for businesses lining people's pockets and promoting services that are connected with the state to improve the president's popularity. So a politicized and corrupt use of money coming into the country, and most of this obviously is off the national book, so away from any kind of public scrutiny. A sixth area of power has been organized crime, which reaches at all levels of the national government, judiciary, the police, the electoral authorities. There's these groups called the tumbadores, which are taking advantage of drug routes, pharmaceutical routes, have gained a lot of power in the country through that way. I wasn't able to get much out of Managua, but I'm directing a program for USAID on extortion in the Northern Triangle, and on the border of Honduras and Nicaragua, there's about 50 blind spots in which these contraband goes in and out. So high level of organized crime in the region, high levels of environmental crime, illegal logging, smuggling, cattle ranching, and other crimes like that, taking advantage of the corruption in the country. Two really excellent groups, the Centro Humboldt and the Fundación de Rio, if you're interested, have done really excellent work on this area. And then finally is the law, which is that the government has passed extremely strict and controlling laws to basically destroy the opposition in the country. The three main laws, one in October 2020, Ley Especial de Ciberdelitos, known as the gag law, in which any kind of information published on social media or independent media considered as anti-government could be people who propagate or publish that could be punished with 1 to 10 years imprisonment. The second law is Ley de Regulación de Agentes Extranjeros, which is basically anyone getting money or support from outside forces. That's also illegal. That's been used, I'll talk about Cristiana Chamorro and her foundation was subject to that law as well. And then the law 1055 in December 2020 against treason or seditious conspiracy is called the guillotine law, which basically anyone seen as opposing the government could be imprisoned. And the government has used these extremely commonly and basically to round up any kind of opponent or presidential candidate in the country. So I want to end with this section with talking about the election. It's very confusing because of the constant political turmoil in the country. But in November, they will be electing a president. They're electing 92 deputies in Congress, which is now dominated almost entirely by the Sandinista party. There's two main alliances. Alianza Cívica, which is led by Juan Sebastián Chamorro, and there's the Unidad Azul y Blanco, which is a confederation of about 100 different organizations. Both of these formed after the April 2018 protests in order to field a single candidate and to cooperate in trying to defeat Ortega in the elections. There's the Coalición Nacional, there's a Progressive Alliance, there's other organizations as well. All of these groups, along with the 11 different political parties, are constantly kept off balance. So, for example, the PRD, which is one of the parties that was remaining that had not been subject to these laws, in May, the government vacated their legal status, so they could no longer field a candidate for president. So basically, all the parties that would be able to have a candidate have been cut off from participating in the election. When I was there in May, they suddenly announced that the registration for registering candidates at all levels would be within a week. So people got just 1 week's notice to register candidates, and you can imagine the chaos and difficulty that ensued for the opposition in that regard. So basically, the opposition at every turn and every possibility has been harassed, forced to flee or arrested in some regard. Nearly all presidential candidates have been arrested. So Cristiana Chamorro, who's probably one of the leading candidates, Felix Maradiaga, who's one of the leaders of the Azul y Blanco, Luis Flay, who is a former Contra leader, Arturo Cruz, and Juan Sebastián Chamorro also have all been detested. Student leaders, campesino leaders, UNAMOS, which is another political party, all their leaders have been arrested. And most probably, the biggest signal of the Ortega's fear and Murillo's fear is that ex-Sandinista dissidents, people who were with them the past 40 years, have also been arrested. So major, kind of icons of the Sandinista movement who are not trusted by Murillo or Ortega have also been arrested. I just have 7 more minutes, so I want to talk briefly about what I was doing there, which is on police reform. So supported by some international agencies, I teamed up with Elvira Quadra, who is a former Sandinista police official and extremely knowledgeable about everything police. And our project was to work with opposition to develop a post-Ortega police reform and what that would entail and what challenges that would need to be done. So we had about 6 months of meetings on Zoom with different social actors, youth groups, the church groups, business, former prisoners, indigenous groups, et cetera, and then 2 weeks in person in May with these groups and with 6 candidates, Cristiana Chamorro, Felix Maradiaga, Luis Flay, Arturo Cruz, and Juan Sebastián Chamorro, sort of the leading candidates. We created an action item, and we have about a 25-page report, which is very technical, but even if you're not interested in police reform, it showed a lot of the undercurrents of opposition and what kind of challenges they would face if Ortega, improbably loses power in November. So basically what they would do. So let me share with you this. Can everyone see this? Great. So this is the hoja de ruta, or sort of roadmap of police reform, which we sort of tried to distill into a pamphlet to talk with different groups around the country. And it has 10 different areas. I'll go them very quickly. The first and most contentious was the purge. And huge debates that we had over what do you do with the police and the military if Ortega's gone, because they've been so extremely and heavily and thoroughly politicized as part of the Sandinista project. And so there's, we called it not an irrational deprivation, but a renovation to try to show that you should get rid of most of them, but not dismiss all the police officers, because that would create extreme levels of violence and unrest in the country after the period. Second is the training and police career. One of the symbols of the nepotism of the Sandinista regime is that after the 2018 uprising, Ortega appointed his son's father-in-law as chief of police, someone who's well known for human rights abuses around the world. And from that is a symbol of also how ideologized the police have become in terms of their mission being focused on the political project of the Sandinistas rather than on citizen security. And there's been a long history of Nicaragua presenting itself as a safe country, as not having any of the problems of its neighbors to the north, which is sort of a important PR part of their regime and something that they are struggling to maintain, obviously, after 2018. The other areas are the structure of the police in terms of centralization, decentralization, and that's connected with the community policing, again, which Nicaragua is known for, but which also has led to extreme levels of violence and nepotism, in the sense that Law 872, which is the police law, allows police stations to basically carry out their own extortion rackets and criminal networks within their areas. So it's been a perversion of decentralization and community policing to the point where the police are corrupt, violent, and connected with organized crime. And that's connected with the need to demilitarize. The sixth step is the budget, because most of the money goes toward high-level police officers and not to the lower levels, which has created a lot of discontent. And again, that's also allowing and encouraging the police to have their own income sources illegally around the country. Independent evaluation, a rational decentralization, accountability, and a constant evaluation. One of the big problems with police reform around the region is that these really good, well-designed projects get implemented and no one evaluates whether they're working or not, and there's no mechanism to adjust it, so they tend to fall apart. And in high levels of political stress that Nicaragua will certainly have in the coming years, this will be extremely important, that there needs to be flexibility in plans as well as clarity in plans in order to make sure that they stay on track. And then the final part we did was having a timeline. What happens in the first 100 days, what happens and here is a sort of a 100 days, first year, and first 4 years. And this was based on some of the work I did with the opposition in Venezuela, where we also had the first 100 hours. So basically, if Maduro, if something happened in Venezuela or something happens in Nicaragua where there's sudden collapse of the government, what do you do to maintain stability in that first few days? They did not want to include that, hoping that there would be a peaceful transition, which looks unlikely. So we decided to put these 10 steps in what's realistic to have them happen during the first mandate of a new government. I just have 2 more minutes, so I just want, and maybe we'll discuss this later, but what are the prospects? What could happen? Probably it looks like it's heading for an uprising and a political crisis. And there's several different possibilities. One, Dennis Martinez, who everyone knows is the famous baseball player from Nicaragua, who, if he ran, could certainly win. And the government is doing everything possible to prevent that from happening. If somehow he becomes a candidate, which is unlikely at this point, that could change the dynamics as well. The second dynamic, as many of you know, Ortega is chronically ill. He has a lot of illnesses. And everyone was thinking that all this repression was a pretense to force Rosario Murillo, who's extremely unpopular even within Sandinismo, onto the electorate. And that would create a new dynamic as well, in which opposition would probably become much stronger. A third option is that the military, in a crisis, will turn against the regime, as we've seen in other countries, Egypt, Philippines. And one of the reasons that might happen is that a lot of the money of the military is in U.S. pensions and U.S. markets. And so they're much more vulnerable to the United States pressure, which may force them or push them against the regime, against it. And also, there is some internal opposition, especially to Murillo. Bayaro Arce, who is the last remaining original Sandinista leader from the revolution to still be in the government, is sort of secret, behind the scenes, creating opposition to Rosario Murillo. And if she's the candidate, that might lead to a sort of internal coup within the government. So those are the different prospects that may unfold, but probably most likely is that there will be an election and a crisis because he probably only has about 10% of support. So the election will be fraudulent and already is fraudulent for sure. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ungar, for your presentation on, the very complex and concerning situation in Nicaragua. Let me just remind those who joined us that if you would like to ask a question to one of our presenters, please type it into the Q&A, and if it's directed towards an individual, one of the three presenters, please note that as well. So we now turn to Dr. Margaret Crahan, who will speak to us about Cuba.
Thank you, Jo Marie. The question I would like to pose was July 11th of this year unprecedented in Cuba? Much of the press and other commentators have reported it or described it as such. However, Cuba has had a long history of public protests and even insurrections. These diminished after 1959. But recently, there have been some changes that have essentially built on the basis of fairly high social and political mobilization in Cuba in the first half of the 20th century in order to result in the type of protests we saw on July 11th. There are also a number of new factors, obviously. The one that is frequently commented on is connectivity in Cuba. The second is the worsening economic situation, which has tended to reduce some of the divisions amongst various socioeconomic groups within Cuba. And so you're getting a much broader spread of discontent over the economic situation, and in particular, the problem of food scarcity. Third problem is the pandemic, which has highlighted the problems that Cuba has had chronically since 1959 about obtaining medical supplies and distributing them, even though they are very much ahead in terms of the development of pharmaceuticals, including COVID vaccines. Another difference between the pre-1959 period and today is that over half of the population was born since the 1959 revolution. And frustration amongst the younger generations in Cuba, and I mean people who are 50 and below, not just people who are in their 20s and 30s, has increased tremendously in recent years when reforms were promised but not realized. So the question arises, to what degree were the July 11th protests exceptional, and to what degree should they be seen as a logical outcome of Cuban history and other developments. Cuba historically has had a very high level of community and geographic solidarity, more than virtually any other Latin American country. This means that even with a government that is highly centralized in terms of the exercise of power, you have had throughout the period from 1959 to the present, a highly communicative civil society. That is, families, communities, professional associations, and other associations have maintained a level of communication within their adherents to a higher degree than has frequently been recognized. Again, even though there is only one political party, politics was a frequent discussion or topic of discussion in the streets, within the home, but also amongst your fellow workers and others. So that Cuba has not been without serious protests, beginning in the 19-teens when Afro-Cubans revolted against the domination of the independence elite to a considerable extent. In the 1930s, you had students allying with disaffected politicians, disaffected people in the working force, as well as disaffected leaders of the private sector to force a change in government. What's different today, in addition to that long history, is connectivity. In the early 90s, when you had protests against the economic crisis and the scarcity of food, fuel, and other necessary basic needs, you did not have the level of connectivity you have today. Today, 40% or 4.2 million Cubans have cell phones, which give them access in many cases, in most cases, to the web. The July 11th protests were also preceded by smaller events in 2019 and 2020, which also benefited from increased connectivity, including, for example, a protest in defense of SNET. SNET is a group of local area networks for gamers. Also, the 27th movement, which commemorates the November 27th rally in front of the Ministry of Culture and the January 27th, 2021 protests, have also benefited very substantially from connectivity, etc. While the movements are not large, the San Isidro and the 27th movement and other movements in different parts of the country, the fact that they were organized, at least at the local and in some cases on the provincial level, and in a few cases on the national level, you have a very different change of scene from the early 1990s protests. What is notable is that even after July 11th, when the internet was shut down, Cubans were able to maintain a degree of communication through some limited access to VPNs outside the country, which gave them access to the internet, as well as surprisingly regular telephone service, which was used not only to communicate within the country, but also without via WhatsApp. So that while the protests revealed the extent of discontent in Cuba, particularly over the economy and the public health issues related to the pandemic, what it also revealed was there was no cohesive national political or social movement or leadership. Nevertheless, the ability to communicate what was happening in San Juan de los Baños, in Havana, in Santiago, in Holguin, Camagüey, and elsewhere served as a stimulus for many people to go out into the streets who might not have gone out into the streets. And this information was communicated primarily by Instagram and other web outlets. The fact that you have had increasing anger in the streets of Cuba as a result of the scarcity of basic foodstuffs, which the government has historically promised would be available as part of their justification of the legitimacy of the government and its control economy. Cubans are increasingly aware of the fact that the economy shrank very substantially in 2020, 11%, according to the Minister of the Economy of Cuba in his late December report on the 2020 economy. The UN's Economic Commission for Latin America has projected that the Cuban economy will shrink in 2021 between 6 and 7%. When the Minister of the Economy gave his report at the end of December, he suggested that the economy would bounce back to a certain extent because of the resumption of tourism. However, the pandemic has decreased tourism tremendously in Cuba. Tourism has declined well over half, and that has cut down on the amount of hard currency Cuba received in order to import foodstuffs and fuel in particular. Cuba imports, it is estimated, 50% of its foodstuffs. There's another problem if you have limited fuel, and that is distribution of foodstuffs from the ports of Havana, Mariel, and Santiago to the cities, particularly in the interior. The demography has also been an issue. In 50% of Cubans lived in rural areas, and a good number were involved in agriculture, although it was in many cases sugar production rather than directly foodstuffs to put on the table. Today, 85% of Cubans are estimated to live in Cuba's cities, scattered across the island, which means that distribution of foodstuffs and fuel becomes eminently more critical and eminently more difficult. Even in terms of the response to COVID, you have problems, particularly in terms of obtaining inputs for syringes, which are not produced in Cuba, and for vaccines, which are produced in Cuba. However, the inputs for the vaccines, which Cuba is producing in increasing numbers, are also limited because they have to be purchased generally with hard currency from abroad. Right now, while the vaccines are more available in Cuba, there are basic medical equipment to treat people with coronavirus that are not available, including such basics as rubber gloves and the masks, etc.
Let me just remind everybody to type in your questions in the Q&A. Once Professor Brenner and then Professor Crahan wraps up her comments, we'll break for Q&A. Professor Brenner.
Thank you, Jo Marie, and thanks to Dr. Crahan, Gretchen Sanchez. This has been so far very informative and a great turnout. I hope, given the size of the crowd, that people are wearing masks and are vaccinated. So let me say that Dr. Crahan provided a beginning and a description of what the current crisis in Cuba is about. There are a large number of articles now available that I'd be happy to provide to everyone through ELAS after this webinar. But let me highlight two articles. There's one by Professor William Leogrand that was published yesterday in World Politics Review that provides a terrific summary of both the protests and the causes of the protests. And then there's one by a Cuban scholar, Juan Guache, in NACLA in the middle of July. And he highlights the important problem of the legitimacy crisis that is confronting the regime. And we have to keep that in mind because that is a source of their calculation. I want to focus on US policy though. And let me take off from Dr. Crahan's historical review by pointing out that one of the things that President Clinton did in the 1990s was he changed the basis of US policy. In his first term of office, it had been focused on reciprocity. We would do something if Cuba did something. But after the Helms-Burton law and after the Brothers to the Rescue shootdown, he actually changed the policy in a much more constructive way, focusing on US interests. President Obama did the same thing. He followed up focusing on US interests. What President Biden has done is essentially return to the failed approach of emphasizing reciprocity. So let me just quickly summarize where the policy stands right now. It's hard to call it a policy. First, there's been nothing changed from the Trump administration. So there's no flow of remittances. President Biden has announced that there is a review being undertaken to consider how remittances might be sent to Cuba. Second, there's a Cuba policy review supposedly taking place, but without an assistant secretary of state for Western Hemispheric affairs, it's very hard to undertake something like that. Third, the US embassy continues to be understaffed because of the alleged probably the so-called sonic attacks. And President announced that that's under review so that the staff might be increased and a consular section brought back to the embassy. But the president has also imposed new sanctions against individuals. These are likely not to have much effect at all because they prevent individuals from holding bank accounts in the United States, which they don't have, or visiting the United States, which they're unlikely to do. That Cuba remains on the list of state sponsors of terrorism. US citizens are limited in their travel to Cuba. And there is an ongoing policy of trying to actively promote this instability through our democracy promotion programs. In short, Biden's policy seems to be based on a false promise that there might be a soft coup. And that is quite unlikely. The Cuban government has some difficulties, but it is not, as Professor Crahan indicated, it's not likely to be overthrown. There is no organized opposition. So what explains the Biden policy? Well, one explanation is that Biden policy is actually towards Cuba is not unique to Cuba. All of Biden's Latin American policy suffers from neglect. Consider Colombia, where the Washington Office in Latin America has done a terrific job of describing the protests that have occurred in Colombia and the repression against the protesters. More than 40 people have been killed. These are protests going on at the same time that the protests in Cuba were going on, where one person was killed. In Colombia, more than 40 people have been killed, and hundreds have been injured by the police repression. Worse, the United States just doesn't, it's not that it simply gives lip service to the sport, it sends weapons to Colombia that are used in this repression. In the Caribbean, there has been a limited action on the widespread pandemic instances of COVID. When the Caribbean countries have been asking for much more, the United States has given not very much. In the case of Peru, it was a contested election, but one person, Keike Fujimori, who was clearly an authoritarian and who lost the election, and the Electoral Council certified that, the President Biden refused to acknowledge essentially the legitimacy of Pedro Castillo's election until very late, further adding to the instability that resulted from the Electoral Commission's slowness in verifying the results. Even with respect to the Northern Triangle, the fact that Kamala Harris, Vice President Harris, is in charge of this policy, and Ricardo Zuniga, a very seasoned and well-respected diplomat, is the point person in charge. There's been total failure. In El Salvador, the administration, U.S. administration, has been rebuffed. In Guatemala, it's been rebuffed so severely that last week, the United States broke its relations with the Attorney General's office because it fired the head of its anti-corruption unit. In short, one explanation for Cuba policy is that it's due to a general neglect on the part of the Biden administration towards Latin America. Yes, he's had many other things to be concerned about: China, the infrastructure, the COVID in the United States. But Latin America, in fact, has been neglected. It took him a while to appoint the Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs, Brian Nichols, but he has not yet been confirmed by the Senate, because the Senate Foreign Relations Committee took a very long time without much pressure from the Biden administration. And he probably won't be confirmed by the Senate until September. It was only last week that the president named the US ambassador to the OAS, Frank Mora, but his nomination has just been sent up to the Senate. So there's not a team in place to handle US foreign policy. And then there are the explanations that are particular to Cuba. So the person who is in charge of Latin American policy is the National Security Advisor for the Western Hemisphere, Juan Gonzalez. Juan Gonzalez did not support President Obama's opening to Cuba when he was on the National Security Council in the Obama administration. There's also been strong opposition from Senator Robert Menendez from New Jersey, although that's, I would say, exaggerated. Menendez is more willing to bend than the White House suggests, and so I think they're exaggerating the obstacle there. But I think the greatest problem is that Biden's political advisors are hell-bent on trying to win Florida, turn it into a purple state, and win some congressional seats, and maybe with Val Demings, the Senate seat in Florida in 2022. This makes it first of all, it's quite unlikely, but it leads them to think that they can do this by catering to hardline Cuban Americans. And the reality is that hardline Cuban Americans are not likely to vote for Biden simply because he's taking a moderate position on Cuba. They have Republicans to vote for who will take a much harder position. There's also, this provides the Biden administration with a way of salvaging some face, because the reason they lost Florida in the 2020 election was not because of Cuban Americans or Venezuelans. It was because they did a terrible job in communicating with the Latinx community. And by focusing on Cuban Americans, they essentially absolved themselves to that failure. Now, Cuba has not helped itself politically in the way it has responded to the protests and in the harsh rhetoric it has applied towards the United States. It makes it more difficult for US politicians to weather criticism that humanitarian aid that might flow to Cuba is going to an authoritarian, brutal regime. And in fact, it's not clear that Cuba is ready to accept too much from the United States. There's an active debate going on in Cuba as to whether that would be a good thing, even in this humanitarian crisis. Consider that one way to, so Silvio Rodriguez, a folk singer, most of you probably know, Silvio Rodriguez wrote a letter, public letter, asking for more openness, release of prisoners who had been involved in protests. And one way to understand that is not that the regime is falling apart, but that he may have even been encouraged by the Ministry of Culture, because there are people in Cuba who want more openness to the United States, and there are people who don't want. And by encouraging Silvio to do this, they're essentially trying to shape the debate. In fact, because Cuba is so vulnerable at this point, hardliners, people who don't want to restore relations with the United States, gain an upper hand, because in fact, the fear is that the United States would use Cuba's vulnerability and an opening to try to have a soft coup, overthrow the regime by pouring United States citizens and internet, whatever, into Cuba to undermine the legitimacy of the regime. And so the opponents of detente, Dr. Crahan and Soraya Castro published a book 4 years ago in which an article that I had there talking about spoilers highlights in fact the problem that there in fact are some sincere spoilers, not people who still believe in the revolution and worry the United States might overthrow the regime. So what can be done? Well, Biden could return US policy to a focus on US interests vis-a-vis Cuba. So let me highlight what I would say are the 5 major interests that the United States has vis-a-vis Cuba. The first would be, do not harm the Cuban people. The US policy should be based on a humane consideration for other people, not on a flawed idea that you can make them suffer so much that they will overthrow their government. That doesn't happen. Second, there's a goal from the United States vis-a-vis Cuba should be to reduce instability, not just in Cuba, but in the region. And Cuba can actually help do that, potentially. It served very well as a mediator in the case of the Colombian government negotiating with the FARC. It could do so potentially in the case of Venezuela, although it's not likely to do so unless the Venezuelan government asked for that, and it's not likely to do so with the United States being so hostile to Cuba. Third, the United States should aim towards achieving mutual benefits. So what are these? So during the Obama administration, there were a large number of agreements signed that dealt with drug enforcement, disaster coordination, medical cooperation, orderly migration and family reunification, freedom for US citizens to travel. All of these would be in the interest of the United States and in the interest of Cuba. And most important, I would say, is a reduction in tension, because that leads to the fourth interest the United States has, and that's human rights. Reduction in tension is an essential step for improving human rights on the island. US hostility only engenders Cuba to curtail freedoms, not to relax freedoms. The US has a $20 million program, as I mentioned, to create disruptions. And while certainly a large part of the demonstrations in this last month were spontaneous, there's significant evidence that some of it came from bots and disinformation that was spread around the country. Recall that 10 years ago, the United States attempted to create a kind of Arab Spring in Cuba with a program called Zunzaneo, a Twitter-like program that was intended to spark mass rallies. And it failed, but this is what the hope is with supporting protesters in Cuba. And in fact, we know that this existed prior to these demonstrations. Now, there's a famous photo of Egyptians protesting in Egypt, but the claim of the photo was that these were millions of people on the Malecón protesting against the Cuban government. And these programs also provide the Cuban government with an excuse to blame the United States and to continue some repression. In fact, all countries limit freedoms when they feel they're under attack. Think about the way in which Americans accepted the restrictions in the Patriot Act after 9/11. When a country feels, especially a small country, in the face of the most powerful country in the world, feels threatened like this, it's bound to limit freedoms. And in fact, when President Obama relaxed the tension, reduced the hostility between the two countries, Cubans gained widespread access to the internet, greater freedom to travel, and the right to buy and sell property. And so it would seem that reduced tension is much more in the US interest of promoting human rights than harshness of the Biden administration program. And the last interest the United States has is improving relations with Western Hemisphere countries. It's notable that last week, Secretary of State Blinken brought out a letter of support for the US criticism of the way Cuba has handled the protests. Only 19 other countries signed the letter. 19 out of 194 countries signed the letter. And only 5 of those were in Latin America. And 4 of those 5 are countries that themselves are repressive countries. And notably, Mexico and Canada were not on the list. How can Biden do this? Well, he can respond to the immediate crisis by removing the requirement for specific licenses to send medical supplies to Cuba, by ending controls on banking and financial transactions related to humanitarian aid. And he can lift the restrictions on remittances. And then in the longer term, he can restore all of the executive orders that President Obama had issued and were turned down by President Trump. He could reverse Trump's unwarranted designation of Cuba as a country on the list of state sponsors of terrorism. He could restaff the consular section. He could restore the US-Cuba Commission, created under the Obama administration, that provided a forum for the two countries to have high-level discussions. And most of all, he can try to implement some of those 22 agreements that need discussion. I'm not saying that the fundamental policy would change, but these ways could bring about a better atmosphere to restore relations with Cuba. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Brenner, for keeping within the time. I just wanted to let everybody know that Dr. Crahan has had some technical issues, and it appears she may not be able to reconnect. I believe she's still trying, but she may not be able to reconnect. So I think what we'll do is we'll go forward with Q&A. I have collected several questions for Dr. Ungar and Dr. Brenner. We'll start with a few questions for Dr. Ungar, and then we'll switch, and then maybe we'll come back to Dr. Ungar. So the first question, I think one of the ones that's most intriguing to me, is how and why did Daniel Ortega make such a radical political change from his, Sandinista era to where we are today?
It's a really good question. I think one of the key points is his loss in 1990 to Violeta Barrios de Chamorro, and the kind of collapse of the ideology of Sandinismo from the 1980s. And his determination not to repeat that, and coming back into power and returning to it. Also divisions within Sandinismo, sort of between the pragmatics or the kind of tougher ones like Ortega and others who have been sort of sidelined or exiled. And I think a gradual, my sense is that the 2018 uprising was central in switching him to become much more authoritarian and digging in his heels to basically take out all the stops to remain in power. Before that, he was in full control, but not as repressive. And so I think that was a moment where he decided the only way to survive was to be repressive. So I think those tendencies, I think the alliances that he made with Aleman, with the business sector, with the religious sector that had been so effective, kind of convinced him that the only way to remain in power is to be political and strategic rather than ideological, which he was certainly much more in the 1980s.
Muted. There are a series of questions about the elections, Mark. Let me just outline a few of them, and maybe you can sort of answer them together. So one person says, with the exception of the Danielista collaborationist parties, no one in Nicaragua believes the elections will be legitimate. Can you clarify your views of the electoral process? Another person questioned why the opposition has remained politically divided vis-a-vis the Ortega regime. Someone asks about Chamorro and says, quote, isn't she part of the reactionary opposition? And what role is the US playing in getting rid of Ortega? Can we trust anyone in the Nicaraguan opposition, end quote. And then lastly, I think this is still connected to the elections question, what investigations from human rights organizations or pressure from international organizations or countries has there been regarding the Ortega's government's actions during this election cycle and over the past couple of years? I hope I didn't overwhelm you with all those questions, but they're very connected. They're very connected.
Exactly, they're connected, and let me respond to them, and let me know if I didn't touch on any of the specific points. The election is completely illegitimate. That's very clear. It will be fraudulent. He has done everything to stop any kind of opposition that's legitimate in the area. And in terms of, the legitimacy of the candidates, the Chamorros are problematic in the sense that there have been 4 Chamorro presidents in Nicaraguan history. So it's very easy for Ortega and Murillo to see them as a sort of pretenders to the throne and feeling that they legitimately owe it. And then there's also the division between the elites and the base, which is talking to people in the barrios in Managua. They don't know, they're very disconnected with that elite. They're a very wealthy family, they're a very powerful family. And so, but there's not a lot of alternatives. None of the candidates can leave their Managua. The campesino, leaders of the campesino movement are also restricted. And this is part of the fragmentation, and going to the question about the opposition, that Ortega and Murillo have been very lucky of inheriting a very fragmented opposition. The country, because of the war in the 1980s, and as in many countries, it's been extremely polarized for very long. And I think that's particularly increased by a couple of things. One is you had the socialist Sandinista revolution, so you had a very strong current of socialism, which the government claims it is still, which it's not. But then you have big business and exporters and alliances with the regime. So you have this sort of schizophrenia between big business, export, and integration with world market, with also socialism. And then the government also calls itself a Christian government, which goes against a lot of the anti-Christian, anti-Catholic Church's institution rebellion. You also have increased inequality, and COVID has obviously made this a lot worse. So between the elites or the middle class and the poor class, which are becoming even poorer, and then you also have regional differences. So one of the projects we were working is with the indigenous groups on the Eastern Coast, who have been always marginalized and always repressed by the country. So, religion, economy, class, the country is extremely polarized, extremely fragmented. As I mentioned, these months of meetings that we had over Zoom, extremely difficult to get on the same page, even on something as basic as police reform, where there should be more of a consensus. The question about Chamorro is that I don't know if I would call the family reactionary. They're very different. Juan Sebastian Chamorro is different from Cristiana. And as everyone knows, in the 1980s and the 1990s, they were divided. Some were pro-Sandinista, some were anti-Sandinista, and they continue to be very different within them. But they represent an elite, but they may be the best bet to get rid of Ortega. And I think they're open to a more equal, an economic and political program that might be more equitable than it would have been in the 1990s.
Okay. I think I'm going to throw a couple questions Phil's way, and then we'll come back to you, Mark, because there are several more questions for you. So again, it's one of these big questions that we'll start with. Is there likely to be any real change as long as Raul Castro is still alive?
So Raul Castro stepped down as the first secretary of the party in April. And so first, it's too soon to know, but Raul Castro was a source of change in Cuba. The fact that he, given who he wasn't able to get as much change as he wanted is quite remarkable and a bad omen for the current president. So even when he had the presidency and being head of the party in his favor, he was unable to get all the reforms they wanted. At the party Congress in 2016, he announced that only 36% of the goals from the previous Congress had been met in terms of economic reform, and a very disappointing amount. And he stepped down as president in 2018. So I would say that the problem is not Raul Castro. The problem is other people in the party who don't want to go along with reform.
Phil, there's another question for you about whether there's any serious debate within the party and the government to accelerate the economic reforms and honor the civil rights provisions of the 2019 Constitution. Would you like to tackle that question?
So first, it's important to recognize there were these provisions in the 2019 Constitution for civil liberties, the right to own property, habeas corpus for the first time. There is, of course, there's a serious debate, because even Diaz-Canel recognized 2 days after the protests that the government had made mistakes. Raul Castro had said in his final statement to the party Congress that the government had lost touch with the ground level, and that is partly what led to these protests, that the people felt that decisions were being made without any discussions at the ground level. And so there are people in the party who think it's very important to open up, to have more, give people greater ability. And then there are those people who are very afraid that it will break down so-called unity. And in the face of a hostile United States, unity is the only thing that's going to prevent the overthrow of the revolution.
Thank you, Dr. Brenner. I'm going to go back to Mark. Mark, I have one commenter who says, I found your presentation very provocative and, quote, disturbing. I don't believe that the FSLN can be reduced to Daniel's caudillo behavior and the socioeconomic gains under the FSLN dismissed. He continues, your work seems clearly US government-based regime change focused, and asks to, hear your reflections based on those comments. And we have Dr. Crahan back with us. That's wonderful. Dr. Ungar.
Yes, thank you. It's an interesting question in terms of what US-based regime change means, whether it's, I assume it's a matter of control and imposing a certain framework, choosing a candidate, trying to manipulate the rules. I know that US officials have been there trying to meet. It's been very difficult. The meetings that we had were always surrounded by the police. The police would enter the meetings. They have a pretty pervasive control. So it's been very difficult on the ground for the US to influence. Obviously, the US has sanctioned a great number of people, all the top officials, which I think is effective. But in terms of choosing a candidate or determining a platform for that candidate, I don't think it's had much success. Whether it would is a different question. And then obviously, there's a question of the other priorities and difficulties that the Biden administration is facing throughout the region with all the elections and all the difficulties, especially with migration from the Northern Triangle. So I don't think they've given it enough focus and probably waiting to see. But it's a really important question in terms of what the US could do, what the US should do, what US should learn from its mistakes with interference and involvement in elections in other countries, that it could backfire, that it could not reflect the interests of the people, especially promoting one of the Chamorros may not be in the interest of the people if they support somebody else. But their options are very limited. Ortega is very skillful at absorbing and resisting pressures from the United States. And obviously, as we all know, it's much closer to Russia and other countries. And so that the sort of financial or political levers of the United States are also much more limited.
Great, thank you, Mark. Dr. Crahan, you are back on line with us. Do you want to offer some concluding reflections? I know you were sort of wrapping up your talk, but I wanted to give you a chance to direct any comments to the members of the audience before we continue with the Q&A session.
No, thank you, Jo Marie. And my apologies. The electricity and the Wi-Fi went out in my building, courtesy of the new elevators that they're installing. So it's a force majeure, I'm afraid. Why don't you continue with the questions?
Okay, very well. So Mark, there's another question for you about the police from my colleague at WOLA, Jeff Thale. He says at one time the Nicaraguan police were one of the triumphs of the Nicaraguan Revolution, a model for the region that had survived the post-1992 changes in government. In the early years of the post-2006 Ortega era, the police leadership resisted political pressures from the government, but eventually Ortega gained control of police leadership. Do you have a sense of how that change happened? And would you care to discuss this issue of government control over the police at the present?
Yeah, and it's a really good question and an important one in terms of the parallel but different trajectory of the police and politics because of their, as Jeff had mentioned, the difference in their patterns. And one, I think, after 2006 is the police as a source of power. led the Ortega government to want to have more direct control over it. Aminta Granero, who was a longtime police commander, was very professional, and those people were gradually replaced by more political appointees and others. A second pattern, I think, was the involvement of the Russians and the sort of ideologization of police training in the Walter Mendoza Police Academy, sort of subsuming the police under that sort of ideology and influenced by more political actors and advisors. And then third, as I mentioned, I think there's a extreme level of low-level corruption and organized crime at the station level of the police in the country for economic, political reasons to help maintain control over barrios as surveillance, et cetera. So I think the police became less professional, less able. But that surveillance also was built on the very excellent community policing program that had been developed and maintained in the 1980s and 1990s. And then finally, the final factor and the most pivotal one was 2018, when he, there's a decree in 2014 which allowed the president to become the supreme commander of the police, sort of getting rid of all the intermediaries. And then he appointed, a nepotistic appointment to that, which sort of finalized the political control by the police. So I think it was gradual. I think it was strategic. And then I think since 2018, it's been much quicker.
Great. Thank you, Mark. Phil, I have a question for you about whether you have any comments on the legislation to lift the embargo on Cuba that was recently introduced in the House and the Senate. The Freedom to Export to Cuba S-1694 Act and the H.R. 3625 U.S.-Cuba Relations Normalization Act. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think they're terrific bills, but the likelihood of their passing is very slight because the Senate has a filibuster, and you need 60 votes, and it's not even clear you'd have 50 Democratic votes. And so I think it's important to get this legislation out as a basis for a reestablishing some dialogue, but it's not going to happen in the near future with the lineup in the Senate. Meg, do you want to respond to that?
No, I agree with you on this one.
Okay. There's another interesting question that I think it's directed to Phil, but I think that Phil or Meg might want to comment on it. Whether it's possible that we see in Cuba the emergence of a political and economic model similar to the Vietnamese model, sort of a post-communist model. Do you have any thoughts on? Do either of you have a comment on that question?
I do. Meg, you haven't had much chance to talk. Do you want to comment, or I'll comment?
Why don't you start and then I'll chime in.
Okay, so first of all, the Vietnamese model has taken many years. And if there's any model that Cuba wants to follow, it is the Vietnamese model. But recognize the difference in size of these countries. Vietnam is about 3 times as large as Cuba in land territory and has a population that's about 8 times greater than Cuba's. And it has enormous natural resources, though some of those were destroyed by the US war. But it was able to mobilize people in a way that is not possible in Cuba because there's a different culture. The Vietnamese have a much more communitarian culture and are willing to put up with sweatshops, which are notorious in Vietnam, or at least they were. It's hard to imagine Cubans putting up with sweatshops. And so there are a variety of reasons. And Vietnam did not have the extensive embargo from a neighbor that Cuba has. And so the model in Vietnam is one that Cuba would like to emulate, but there are a lot of obstacles for pursuing them. Meg?
Yeah, I might disagree slightly with Phil on the issue of the Cubans would like to emulate the Vietnamese model, because you hear frequently from Cuban economists, both within the universities as well as within the government itself, a certain resistance to the advice that the Vietnamese have been offering them going back, I would say, easily 15 years, in terms of the transformation of the financial system, in terms of their export model, in terms of a whole series of issues. You frequently hear from, including, as I said, from within the government, a sense that it's all very well for the Vietnamese to make these recommendations, but they do not live our reality. And so I'm not sure whether they really want to emulate it. I think there's a desire to solve some of these problems on their own, with their own models.
Max, since we have you talking, there was it's more of a comment than a question about connectivity. And the person who made the comment was referring to a White House background briefing, referring to the cuts of connectivity between 30 minutes to an hour, or a little bit more on the island, selective blocking of websites and areas where there were specific protests. I wonder if you had any further comment on this issue of connectivity, its role in the protests, and the future of the role of the internet in Cuban politics.
It is true that on the 11th and thereafter, there were definite cuts in connectivity on the part of the government in Cuba. Nevertheless, given the Cuban talent to work around many different impediments, it was interesting to receive through VPNs or through WhatsApp and other mechanisms calls in the days following the protests. I was amazed at the number of calls that I received, et cetera. And when I asked people, how did you get on, et cetera, they mentioned that they had a VPN connection outside of Cuba. Many individuals used WhatsApp, et cetera. So that now this is not, the 4 million people who have access to cell phones. This is probably a small percentage of that. But since there was, amidst the many complaints about being cut off from the internet, other people who obviously were still able to continue in one fashion or another to communicate, et cetera. And there are also a number of bots, et cetera, outside the country that were being used, et cetera. And I think going forward, probably you're going to have more work on the part of Cubans within Cuba and people outside to prepare for a problem with connectivity in the future.
Thanks, Meg. Phil, I have a question for you. Richard Zuniga was just named, or yesterday or today, was named Acting Assistant Secretary for Western Hemisphere Affairs, and Frank Mora was named Ambassador to the OAS. And the question says, if they do remittances, the embassy, consulate, and announced travel, could this be an important step towards re-engagement? And there's another related question on US policy, which is it possible that the basis for a more reasonable policy is being laid? Obama allowed Cuba to experience some economic opening, whetting Cubans' appetite for more. Could this be behind today's protests? Of course, helped by connectivity, as Meg indicated. And perhaps Meg would also care to comment on either of those questions.
I think that the naming of Ricardo Zuniga to the post is a very positive step. He was involved in the 18 months of negotiations with Cuba at the time during the Obama administration. I think that probably he retains an interest in it, and he'll probably, I would hope, be a voice for a rethinking of the Cuba policy, and perhaps also a voice for reacting more rapidly than in the past. I think that another step that could be taken and should be taken as fast as possible is to restaff the embassy, the US Embassy and the consulate, in order to make travel between the two countries more possible than it is now. I've heard that there have been conversations within the embassy about how to restaff effectively, and that seems to be a positive step. People in Cuba from the entrepreneurial sector have been invited in for meetings to solicit their suggestions and recommendations, amongst others. So that I think that this, within context, is all positive.
I would agree with Dr. Crahan. I would note that the United States, that President Trump never appointed an ambassador to Cuba, while the Cubans did appoint an ambassador to the United States. And President Biden hasn't made any, indicated any sign that he is about to appoint an ambassador. I think that would be an important step. Of course, opening the embassy would make it easier for Cubans to travel to the United States. It would make it easier for there to be exchanges by scholars if we're willing to give them visas. And those are all things that are positives. But what really has to happen is removing Cuba from the list of state sponsors of terrorism. The major charge against Cuba currently is that it supports Venezuela, which allegedly is a terrorist state, but Venezuela is not on the list itself. And so there seems to be an anomaly there.
Thank you to both of you. Mark, let me turn to you. I have a question here about the different positions within the Nicaraguan armed forces. If you could perhaps lay those out. You did mention at one point in your presentation the slight possibility of some kind of military coup along the way. Could you talk about that, please, for us?
I'm not a military coup, but I would say that there's at this point a high likelihood that there will be a collapse in November with the election, because the election is illegitimate and will be fraudulent, and people know that. And if Ortega tries to steal it, we'll have a similar situation where the military may be in a position to pivot and change sides against the regime, which is not very well liked by other top officials. So the military is obviously a black box, and we don't know what's going on inside. But one, I think, benefit is that they're more professional. They're less politicized, so they're more likely to want to maintain stability and not pay the stability at the cost of continuing Orteguismo. And then, as I mentioned before, I think they're highly attuned to the country's economic future in the sense of much more being tied to the United States, Western Hemisphere, trade within the region, and a rupture that, for example, that we're seeing in El Salvador will put that at risk. So I think the military is particularly attuned to the economic prospects of the country after the election. So the professionalism, the economics, I think, are positive signs, but they may not be sufficient at this point. That they're not going to proactively overthrow the regime, but may react when there's a crisis.
Okay, thanks for that, Mark. Then there's a question about the mass exodus of professionals and student opposition leaders since the April 2018 repression, primarily to Costa Rica. And the person who asked the question said, it appears these groups are mounting strong organized resistance abroad, or at least with a broad incorporation of exiled constituents. For example, the group SOS Nicaragua. Is there any talk about this in Managua that you're aware, or are you aware of whether these groups have had any success in mounting pressure? Any response to that?
Yeah, I think they have had limited success changing the political trajectory of the country within Nicaragua, but major success in documenting rights abuse. So many of you may have read the High Commissioner for Human Rights report, Michelle Bachelet's report on prisoners and torture and other human rights abuses. And they've been central in attaining that documentation, working with people in the country, connecting, thanks to Zoom, ex-political prisoners to get that documentation, et cetera. So they've helped really maintain at least some level of pressure from the human rights community, from the international community, as much as they possibly can. And however, I think their disbursement, so many are in Costa Rica, Mexico, the United States, Colombia in particular, they've been less effective than they probably could be because they're not concentrated geographically. But they've been central in the human rights reports and the human rights documentation. I have a lot of, there's been some great reports that behind the scenes, the exiles have been central to. And I would also point out the journalists. There's amazing journalists still in the country, working now outside the country, who have fled, who can provide real insight to the context of those rights abuses.
There's a very specific question, since you're on the issue of rights abuses, a very specific question about whether there are any US citizens in Nicaraguan prisons, to your knowledge.
I don't think so. I can't be 100% sure. We met with some ex-officials working with the penitentiary system. There are a lot of other national Hondurans, Haitians, Colombians, Mexicans, but no one mentioned the United States. And I would have expected they might have mentioned it to me in that discussion. So I suspect there aren't any, but I can't be sure.
Thanks, Mark. So let me bounce back to Cuba. So here's a question I think is worth, maybe Meg and Phil would have a response to this. Whether the current Biden policy towards Cuba is really just a good electoral strategy.
So, Meg, I'll give you the first shot if you want, or I can.
Go ahead.
So it's not a very good electoral strategy. For one thing, the Florida International Poll that Guillermo Brenner has every year, the last poll showed that while for the first time Cuban Americans support the embargo, they don't support the cutback in remittances, the limitations on travel. And in 2008, Senator Obama campaigned precisely on getting rid of those kinds of restrictions. And it was a popular point. He increased his percentage of Cuban American vote. And then in 2012, he actually got a majority of the Cuban American vote. The Cuban American community has changed somewhat. There's no question. There are more younger people now who are opposing the policy, but people still have family in Cuba. They still want to be able to send their remittances. There is a humanitarian crisis in Cuba, and they don't want their families to be suffering. And the current policy prevents them from doing this. So let's be clear what that means. That the main conduit for sending money to Cuba was Western Union. And the Trump administration ruled that because Western Union's counterpart was owned by the Cuban military or controlled by the Cuban military, Western Union couldn't do business with them. And so it forbid Western Union from transmitting funds to Cuba. So now you can find ways around this, but it becomes much more expensive and much more difficult to send remittances to Cuba. So I would say just on those two policies alone, the Biden administration would gain votes by changing the rules rather than by following Trump's lead.
Yeah, the House Democratic Caucus did an after-action report after the elections in November of 2020, looking at the Florida Democratic campaign for House of Representatives, for the Senate, and even more than for the presidency. And they had a very critical report in terms of the failure of the National Democratic Party, particularly to support the Florida Democratic Party in terms of providing the resources and encouraging them to target more working class families, middle class families in urban areas, the rural areas, etc. Their conclusion overall, there was a lot more specifics, but their conclusion overall was not that the issue of Cuba was the major problem in terms of protecting the two Democratic House seats and other and dealing with the margins of support for the presidency. The basic failure that they saw was not related to U.S. policy towards Cuba, but rather Democratic Party outreach to certain categories of voters, as well as the message. And the message was not sufficiently responsive, particularly to the economic concerns of traditional Democratic voters or attracting new Democratic voters. And so there was a very sharp criticism of the party policy rather than in terms of seeing the issue of U.S. policy towards Cuba being determinate.
Thanks, Meg. Bill. So I have two very specific questions for both of you that maybe you'll be able to answer. One is asking where Cuba currently obtains its arms from since the breakup. Well, since the breakup of the USSR, so it's not just right now, but over the last several decades. And then to what extent can Mexican assistance relieve food scarcity in Cuba? Do either of you have a comment on either of those questions, Bill or Meg?
Food is.
Go ahead, Meg.
The Mexican government has, and Mexican humanitarian groups are beginning. There are two ships just recently left with foodstuffs to Cuba, etc. And there are plans for more. There are some other countries that are also preparing to provide some humanitarian assistance. Some European humanitarian groups are preparing substantial shipments of foodstuffs, as well as some medical supplies, etc. As a matter of fact, the scarcity of syringes, there's already been from the US and Europe a tremendous amount of syringes and related materials that have been collected and will shortly be arriving in Cuba, etc. Foodstuffs are much more difficult. And it would be, if we could go back to Bush II's policy, which was difficult for the Cubans because it required cash on the barrelhead, but it did allow for substantial food exports from the US, particularly of chicken, rice, and a couple other items, etc. That would greatly improve it. I'm not recommending the policy of cash on the barrelhead. And I think given the current scarcities in Cuba, humanitarian aid through Oxfam, Caritas, the Catholic Humanitarian Aid Assistance, is really imperative now. And any US restrictions on that should be lifted as a humanitarian gesture.
So one of the restrictions that Meg is referring to is the fact that an organization like Oxfam has to certify that none of the aid is going to the military or to the government. And so how you certify that becomes very difficult and cumbersome, and that you can't just do that once. You have to do that for every shipment. And so it's quite an onerous process, which is why providing aid through from the United States has been so hard. And Mexican aid becomes that much more important. The military, Cuba signed a military agreement with Russia 2 years ago that provides for military assistance. And it's in the form of a loan, but in the past, Russia has forgiven those loans. But the Cuban military is significantly downsized from what it had been 30 years ago. And much of what they've been able to do is essentially take spare parts from discarded weaponry and reuse them for other weaponry, because their military is simply so small. They don't even, for example, do training exercises anymore because of the scarcity of fuel. They don't want to advertise this because it seems to make them vulnerable, but nonetheless, the military component of Cuba's expenditures are very low.
There's a comment that I wanted to raise that John McCullough typed into the Q&A box. It says, the head of the Democratic Party in Florida was a lawyer involved in the effort to keep Elian in Florida. He did not support Obama's opening. The problem is which Democrats the White House listens to. Unfortunately, the primary Democratic candidates for Senate and governor have taken the anti-Cuba position in the current crisis. Do either of you care to respond to this comment?
Right on. It's a very astute comment.
Meg, any follow-up?
No, I agree with Phil.
Okay, very good. Mark, I have a question here. The question asks if the situation in Nicaragua is comparable to what they describe as, quote, the Charles Koch-led effort to control Honduras. I'm not quite sure what that's referring to, but the question is there any connection to Honduras, and is there any, do you have any comment on that question?
Maybe the questioner could clarify, but my understanding of the Koch brothers' involvement in Latin America has been promoting, obviously, free trade, neoliberalism, in conjunction with right wing. In places like even in the Amazon and also in Central America, expansion of palm oil, big agriculture, which has been central to the affiliates with Koch Industries. So I think that's what the question refers to. I'm in Honduras quite often and haven't heard anything recently regarding them in particular. But I think Nicaragua is an unusual case because it's a quote unquote Christian socialist regime, which is now a dictatorship. And so the neoliberalism is part of that in terms of engagement with the international economy. So maybe there's some role that I've never heard of the Koch brothers in Nicaragua, but as far as I can tell, it's minimal, direct intervention, but the model probably has a lot of supporters.
Great, thanks for that, Mark. This is a very interesting question that perhaps Meg or Phil could tackle. How is climate change, seemingly more potent in the global south, affecting Cuba right now? Any takers?
So that's from Larry Wilkerson, and I appreciate that Larry has been on this webinar. He's also an astute observer. Cuba has been remarkable in the efforts to deal with the environment, given that it's a poor country, but it has limited resources. And what's interesting is that one of the 22 memorandum of understanding with the United States concerned exchanging information on environmental protection. But even during the Obama administration, the only kind of exchanges occurred were through civil society, private groups, not through government-to-government exchanges. Cuba clearly has a problem with rising sea levels, and they've been working on that problem because they get regular floods in Havana, Santiago, but they don't have a solution to that. And as Dr. Wilkerson points out, there's the problem of seawater seeping into the ground level water that undermines their ability to grow things. And they don't have the money. It's a very real problem that they're both aware of and that they don't know what to do about it.
If I can add a bit, the Cuba program at Columbia held a conference on February 22nd of this year to explore the possibility that the existing memorandums of understanding that were never canceled by the Trump administration might be used to encourage a return to a dialogue on common issues relating to climate change and particularly sustainability. Even prior to the Obama administration, there are certain agreements that existed between US government entities like NOAA, as well as their counterparts in Cuba. During the Obama administration, there were agreements signed and exchanges and joint projects between the Department of Agriculture and some US environmental groups, NGOs, and others. Indeed, probably outside of the cooperation between the US Coast Guard and their Cuban counterparts, the most extensive cooperation between the US and Cuba over the past 25 years has been between environmental interests within the US government, as well as outside the US government on a whole series of issues. And it continues, although at a lower level than during the Obama administration. And there are plans afoot together with some other Caribbean nations, as well as Mexico, to continue some of the existing agreements and cooperative efforts. And the conference report will come out next month, so you can read all about it then.
Mhm.
It will be on the Cuba program website.
Excellent. I can attest to the fact that Meg is working very hard on that report. I hear about it all the time. We are just at about 7:45, so I want to take this last opportunity to thank all of those who came this afternoon to listen to our three very distinguished speakers. And I want to thank them, Dr. Ungar, Dr. Crahan, Dr. Brenner, for your insights. Thanks to the Cuba program and the Institute of Latin American Studies at Columbia University for organizing this event. Thanks to Gretchen for doing all the logistics, and especially for dealing with the chat bomb person who unfortunately interrupted the seminar for a moment there. And luckily we got that under control. So thank you again all for being here, and have a nice evening, and take care.
Thank you, Jo Marie.
Thank you,
Thanks
Jo
very
Marie. Terrific moderator.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
See you all in September.
Excellent.
Thank you.